I think.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here at this month's IPPSR Public Policy Forum on a very nice June afternoon. Very pleased to have you all here today. My name is Arnold Weinfeld. I'm Associate Director at the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. We're located in the College of Social Science, and we like to do these forums once a month while the legislature is in session to discuss issues of public interest and that are current before policymakers and the public. As you may know, we have several other programs. For instance, our Michigan Political Leadership Program, which is now taking applications. If you're interested in a 10-month, one weekend a month program that will assist you in your endeavor to maybe one day run for public office. We bring in people to talk about public administration, politics and campaigning, and leadership as well during that 10-month time. So you can apply for that as an application program. We also have our State of the State survey, State of the State podcast, and other programs you can find on our website, ippsr.msu.edu. But today's program, and today I should say today's program is an outgrowth of one of our initiatives, our Michigan Applied Public Policy Research Program, where we give small grants to faculty members on campus at Michigan State who are doing research on public policy issues. And so the one today was a grant to Dr. Eric Scorsone and his team at the Center for Local Government and Finance Policy on campus to investigate how American Rescue Plan Program funds were being spent around the state. And as I said, so with us today, of course, we have Dr. Scorsone, who is director of the MSU Extension Center for Local Government Finance and Policy. He's been at MSU most of the time since 2005, but has also served as a senior economist for the Senate Fiscal Agency and the Deputy State Treasurer. Prior to joining MSU, he was with the University of Kentucky and also served as an economist for the Colorado Governor's Office of State Planning and Budget, and is a senior economist for the city of Aurora, Colorado. Eric is very well known across the state for his research on state and local government finance. Also with us is Jonathan Oosting, capital reporter for Bridge Magazine, who covers government and politics as a member of Bridge's team. Jonathan was named 2021 Journalist of the Year by the Michigan Press Association, and he also covered the state capitol for the Detroit News and NLive before joining Bridge in September 2019. And also with us is Craig Thiel. Craig is the Citizens Research Council's Research Director and primary researcher of education and school finance issues. Craig has also worked as a fiscal analyst at the state government level for both the State Senate Fiscal Agency and the House Fiscal Agency. He also worked for the Michigan Department of State Office of Policy and Planning and the U.S. EPA in Chicago, and is also no stranger to state and local government finance issues here in Michigan. And with that, I'm going to kick things off and turn it over to Dr. Scorsone.
Thanks, Arnold. Good to see everyone. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about local government side of ARPA. Craig's going to talk about the education side, and then Jonathan, I think, is going to cover some kind of what's very specifically in the communities, what's going on. So first of all, let me give you context. So the U.S. economy is about $20 trillion a year. The U.S. government pushed out over the span of essentially 2 years $5 trillion in COVID relief through a number of different acts, including ARPA. ARPA was only one of them. There were several others. ARPA was about $1.9 trillion. It did many, many different things, which we're not going to cover today. The state, local fiscal recovery funds, the SLRF, everything has to have an acronym in government. So it was about $350 billion. It was given to state and local governments and tribal governments. Michigan got about $9 billion in total, and local governments got about $4 billion of that. And I'm not going to touch on how the state's dealing with their funds today. So that gives you kind of, so it's a huge amount of money, and you have to remember at the time in 2020, the fear was, I mean, it was the biggest increase in unemployment in history, even bigger than the Great Depression. If you look at some communities in Michigan, the unemployment rate was, for example, in Flint, about 50%. So there was a real fear of why we need these funds. And local governments have struggled with this a bit because the funds are intended to stimulate the economy and not to just be sat on and kind of make their balance sheets better, which unfortunately that's probably what they wish they could do with it. And there's some things I'll talk about why the money was kind of programmed the way it was, and why there are some issues why local governments feel maybe is not as effective as it could be perhaps. So again, in March 2021, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act, which was to provide all kinds of money, provide money to hospitals, to all kinds of other things besides this. But this program in particular, this $250 billion, was important. This was in addition to monies that have been given to local governments prior under the CARES Act. The CARES Act, though, money was much more limited. It was very limited to COVID relief specifically, and I had started working with the mayor of Flint in November of 2019, and when the pandemic hit, we did not have things like masks or, protection for police and fire. So we were spending money for things like that, ventilation, so that money was very specifically targeted to those kind of things. The SLURF money is much broader. Its use is much different than the original CARES Act money. It can be used for addressing negative economic impact of the pandemic. So for example, if you're a tourism community, you want to bolster some things in your community. It could be used to help small businesses who were hit by the pandemic. We know many businesses did close, and that kind of thing, to help households who were hit by pandemic-related issues. Premium pay has been a big one for especially, this was a big battle, like who is essential workers, who has to be at their job. Police and fire don't get to sit at the computer. Water and sewer workers, if they're sitting at their computer, they're not fixing the things that need to get fixed. So, those people do have to go on the front lines. They are exposed to a deadly virus. And so they were given premium pay by many communities for that work. Revenue loss is going to be a big one. This money can essentially be used to backfill what revenue was lost during the pandemic. And then probably one of the ones where we do see a lot of activity is water, sewer, and broadband. Broadband related to this notion that, we need broadband if, as more and more rural workers is occurring, particularly in rural areas, you need better access. And then water and sewer is fundamental. If you have a pandemic, people need water, right? They need clean water, they need to have hygiene. So there are a lot of programs around making sure those things that we often take for granted, quite frankly, are invested in. And then that's a big issue that is going to go beyond even this program. What is prohibited is pension fund deposits, which is one thing I think Michigan local governments probably would have wanted. But, from the federal government's perspective, that wasn't going to help anything related to the pandemic. So that is prohibited. Cutting taxes, there was a real battle over that because obviously the federal government doesn't want you to just take their money, cut taxes, and then use it for the stuff that you would have done anyway. And then just sitting on it, paying for judgments, settlements, or just sitting on the money as a rainy day fund. You can sit on the money, and actually you can make interest on this money and keep it, which is fairly not typical of federal programs. So there may be some delays in spending for that reason because interest rates have risen a lot. But ultimately you do have to spend the money or give it back. So I think eventually people will get through it ultimately. This is just kind of give you a broad sense. Counties got 65 billion. Metropolitan cities, which is a weird term, it doesn't really mean what we normally think of, but it's kind of the bigger places basically got 45 billion. Territories like got money. Tribal governments, so there's many tribal governments in Michigan, for example. And then 9 entitlement units, that would be what we call the smalls. So Michigan has 1,800 local governments. Most of them are small, and they got a certain money that was first given to the state and then allocated to them. Our breakdown: counties got 2 billion, and not surprisingly, we have about 70 governments that got the majority of the money. So Wayne County, Oakland County, Detroit. Flint, Saginaw, the places you'd expect to some extent, but it's not only based on population. There's really like a sort of economic distress factor, I guess I would call it. So, like Flint got more than Lansing, but Flint is smaller than Lansing actually by quite a bit now. So there's not like a clear like just population only. And the non-entitlement units, now that those, 600 million, that's actually less than Detroit got, so all the other governments got less than Detroit. But if you think about it, if you have a budget of, say, $1 million a year, and you're given $300,000 or $400,000, that's a lot of money for a small community. So it's sort of deceptive in the sense that actually it is a lot of money for a lot of small communities, even though in total it doesn't seem that much. So as I said, over 77% of the money went to 64 governments. You can see the per capita ranges, so it does vary a lot on a per capita basis. I think Detroit got about 800 million, for example. Flint got about 100 million. I think Saginaw got 40 or 50 million. So that just gives you a sense, and that's a big amount of money. So like in Flint, the general fund budget is 55 million. So 100 million is twice what the general fund is. Same would probably be true for Saginaw. But in Detroit's case, their general fund's probably over $1 billion. So it's always proportional to what people are getting and how that kind of plays out. Here you can see, so Detroit has got about 800 million, which is $1,200 per person. If we go down the list, like Grand Rapids got 90 million, so actually less than Flint, even though Grand Rapids is probably twice as big. And you can see that in the per capita numbers. Flint has almost 1,000 per person. Again, that's reflecting that this was given based on sort of not just population, many other factors. Saginaw also got over 1,000 per person, whereas like Dearborn got 47 million. So it does vary a lot. And as you'd expect, the goal here was to give money and then give a lot of discretion, not total discretion, but a lot of discretion about how to spend the money so that it was locally adapted, which I think is a good thing, absolutely. This is more money than was given out during the 70s and 80s through general revenue sharing. So in the 70s and 80s, there was federal revenue sharing to local governments. It was ended in about 85, but it started under Nixon. And even if you look at the whole 10-year period and you adjust for inflation, this was more money than that, actually. So it is a lot of money, but we don't expect it to continue. There's no indication it's ever going to continue. It's pretty much a one-time thing. That does bring up some tough questions, though, because if this is truly one-time money, which we have to expect it is, then you don't want to be building costs ongoing based on one-time money. And that's one of the concerns, and it's very interesting. The European Union has done something similar for their local governments, and they have the same issues of making sure, this doesn't get built into budgets going forward, and then you can't afford it, right? Because revenues in Michigan don't normally grow that much, maybe 2% a year. So what we do want to see is making sure local governments aren't sort of building ongoing costs that they can't afford later on. This is going to be a common theme, I'm guessing. There is a frustration, I think, among a lot of us about the transparency of this money. I think Michigan, quite frankly, could have done a better job. A lot of states have much better reporting on ARPA dollars. In fact, not only just at the state, but I've even seen local governments, and I won't say who, but let's say battling each other for this information, like between the council and the mayor. So it's very frustrating, I feel like, because for the press, for university researchers and others to kind of get out there and see what's going on with this money, to provide transparency and accountability, we have to have access to the information. And unfortunately, this is being buried in a lot of bureaucracy that's very hard to penetrate. And I think that is kind of a frustration of mine that we should have done a better job on. And so I do hope in the future with these kind of things, we think about not just what the federal government's going to require, because the reality is the U.S. Treasury, who gives this money out, is backing off their requirements more and more to the point where it's almost going to be all we'll really know is was the money spent or not how it was spent. And so that's frustrating because this is a huge investment. And it really needs to be something important for our economy's long-term potential. Because quite frankly, Michigan's potential is not great. And we need to do a much better job. The population issues have been discussed recently, but even if you look at long-term economic prospects, I mean, this kind of investment is really needed to bolster where we need to be going. So it is important to understand how the money is being spent. What we see so far from what we can tell, and this is mostly for the larger ones, because the smaller ones understandably have less reporting requirements, and they're not required to report as much. I mean, that's pretty typical. About 30% of the money has been obligated to be spent. There are a few areas where there's been almost total obligation of the spending. And some where there's like less than 5%, but the average is about 30. So that's, you could say, well, how far in are we this? We're almost, 2 years in. We have about, depending on whether you're thinking of encumbrance or actual spend, it's, 2 or 3 years more. So maybe we're on track, maybe we're not. Actually, at the last IPPSR event, we were talking about this issue of, the constraints to spend money is real. Like if you're giving somebody like a Flint $94 million, like you can't just spend that quickly. You have to go through procurement. You have to go through council approvals. You have to go through getting people who can do actual work. I mean, I'll give an example. The Flint City Treasury Department had hired 2 people in the last week, and within the first 2 days they had both quit. Now, there may be many reasons why that happened, but I mean, that's the problems we're facing with labor force in local government. There are huge issues with labor force right now, which we talked about at the last IPPSR event. There are issues on getting contractors to do work, whether it's, big construction work, water, sewers. You just cannot get people to do work. So you can have lots of money, it could be sitting there, you know what you want to even spend it on. You have council resolutions passed and everything in order, but you still can't get the work done in a timely fashion. So there is a lot of issues that are causing some of this, lack of spending to occur. The Federal Reserve, on the other hand, might actually be happy about that because they may not want this money out of the economy right now. They're trying to slow the economy down. So depends on who you are, maybe, how you feel about this. This is giving you a sense of who's spent. So Detroit, I mean, I have to say, had a very good plan, very well thought out plan right off the bat. They spent about 31%. You can see Macomb County has spent very little. Now this is somewhat dated, there's a data lag here, but but again, you can see Washtenaw, Ingham have spent a lot, but Dearborn, almost nothing. Kalamazoo spent almost everything. So it varies a lot. But again, the concern is making sure we do want to spend this money. We want to make sure that there is an accountability that the money does get used and gets used effectively. Obviously, both those things. So that's some sense of where we are today. And again, I don't think it's panic time. There is still a decent amount of time left to spend the money. But if you live in any of these communities, this is the kind of things to be thinking about. What are we using this money for? Are we investing in our economy and our workforce in an effective manner? So where's the money going for? This just gives you a sense. It's, I think Jonathan will talk about some specific projects, but Public health, not surprising, a lot. Now, a lot of that might be county governments because they run most of the public health infrastructure. Negative economic impact, we see some spending there. And that again might be related to household or business assistance, for example, who have been impacted by the pandemic. Again, premium pay. You can see some there, not a huge percent perhaps, but it is an important area. Infrastructure, my guess is that's where a lot of the money will end up going, hopefully, because we do have a lot of infrastructure issues. But we also have to factor in that there's a lot of other federal legislation that's been passed recently, so it's hard to say maybe how that will play out over time. Revenue replacement will be a big one probably because that's kind of the catch-all, and they have expanded that to be more flexible. And that's going to be used for general operations kinds of things. I mean, I do worry a little bit about that because that is potentially where you could build in your budgets to get a little bigger than they should be, quite frankly. So I think there has to be a really careful attention to detail. And again, there is a lot of shortages. I mean, CFOs is a great example of there's been a lot of problems for cities hiring CFOs recently and keeping them. With the wage differentials, and so that's another area where again you need good staff, you need good accountants because you got to track this money, you got to know what's happening. So hopefully that will happen over time. Just to kind of give you a sense, so this is just kind of examples. In the public health space, mental health, which is a big one, we have a real issue there. Hopefully we will spend some money in that over time. On the negative economic impact side, you see a lot of housing assistance programs, community health benefits, demolition. I know, for example, Flynn is using a lot for demolition kinds of programs. Again, premium pay, public sector capacity. This is some examples that we've seen, and I don't want to take too much time on this, but things like water main replacements, lead abatement, first responder communications upgrades, river trail cleanups, ADA compliance, treatment plant expansion. So this isn't, these are, I would consider this good investments. I mean, I haven't looked at every single one of these. There's hundreds of these, but these are the kind of things I think that are the kind of things local governments have been lacking for a long time in being able to invest. I mean, one contextual thing I would say is that given the problems of local governments in the last 20 years in this state, they have not been able to do much investment in capital in particular. So this money is helping us do some of the things we should have been doing probably for the last 20 years, because most of the money local governments have has been going to operational costs, pension costs particularly. And so these are things that have to go by the wayside often. These are one of the first things, if you study public finance and sort of cut back budgeting, one of the first things to cut back are all this kind of stuff right here. So that is good to see. I think local governments are doing the responsible thing. Other examples of things here. The smaller governments, we don't have as much information about, but mostly it's been revenue replacement. I think smaller governments often don't have as much infrastructure, so they're kind of like, they often don't even have a lot of employees. So they may not have a lot of premium pay needs either. So they probably are going to just put it into revenue replacement, and then maybe they'll figure out an infrastructure project down the road perhaps, but not surprising. We just don't have as much good information there. So thanks a lot. This is there's more information on our website, really detailed information, the report we did for Arnold Shop, and thank you.
Well, yes, Eric mentioned there'll be some common themes with my comments as I talk about the education pieces. Let me just take a moment of personal privilege and thank Arnold for inviting the Citizens Research Council here. We've had a long-standing relationship with IPPSR and these panels, and I appreciate the opportunity to present here today. My involvement has been on just kind of following how this money's come in, how much we're talking about, how school districts are using it, and kind of the bigger picture on what the effects have been on the larger K through 12 revenue picture across the state in the last 3 years. We issued a report in January that tried to distill all of our research to date on the relief funding that's been coming to Michigan. It's available on our website for free. Some of my material is pulled directly from that, some of it is pulled from previous analysis that we've done, which is also on our website. So with that, let me just kind of walk you through the chronology, and Eric mentioned the various relief packages that came from the federal government. I'm focusing on a specific tranche of revenue that has been coming to Michigan school districts, 3 different packages. It's called the ESSER, a little more appropriate than slurf, I think, in terms of coming off the tongue. But each of these packages has been exponentially larger than the one before it. So if we go back to the CARES Act, Michigan received about $390 million. And that was right after the pandemic hit, early spring 2020. Then in December of 2020, there was a supplemental appropriation at the federal level that brought Michigan another $1.7 billion. So that's 4 times the first package. And then months later, ARPA hits, and Michigan schools, or Michigan education, I should say, received about $3.7 billion, about 10 times the amount that was in CARES. So all total, that's about $5.8 billion through this ESSER fund. And just the ESSER fund is part of the Federal Education Stabilization Fund, which provided funding to institutions of higher education, K through 12 education, private schools. That larger pot was $7.9 billion that came into Michigan. ESSER accounts for about $5.8 billion, so more than about 3/4 of the total education relief came down for K through 12 education. And with each of these packages of money, there was a deadline. Eric mentioned encumbrances and obligations. So CARES had to be obligated in by September 2022. The supplemental resources that came in December had to be obligated by September 2023, so we're just a few months away from there. And then the ARPA money as a September 2024 deadline. The federal government has allowed some expenditures related to capital facility investments that districts are making with this money to extend about 18 months beyond this 2024. So there's going to be a long spending tail on some of these ARPA dollars with regards to the capital investments. So, and I apologize if you can't see these numbers. The slide deck, I think, is going to be made available. So, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the scale of funding. One of the things I was interested in is to see how this $5.8 billion looked in the context of Michigan K through 12 funding going back a number of years. So I went back and looked from 1987 to FY20, looked at total K through 12 revenue coming in to all school districts across the state of Michigan. And on average, and this is adjusted for inflation, about $175 million incremental increase year over year. So some years larger, some years smaller. The largest single year increase prior to this ESSER funding hitting, not surprising, was Proposal A, when we rejiggered the school finance program in Michigan. And on an inflation adjusted basis, it's about, it resulted in about $1 billion, a little over $1 billion annual increase. So this $6 billion increase is 4 times what happened in Proposal A. It is 3 times as large as the ongoing revenue that comes from the federal government every year. So we're talking about the largest single investment in K through 12 education. So this is a very important topic, and so the fact that we're having this discussion today really ties into the importance of this revenue in kind of the history of Michigan K through 12 finance. So the table on the left, which you can't see, really breaks down the allocations across different school districts in the state of Michigan. And what the feds decided to do to get the money out as quickly as possible is they used an existing federal formula called the Title I formula, which has been on the books going back to the early 70s. It's designed to provide additional federal resources to largely low-income school districts to help with compensatory education. So they threw this money into the Title I formula, and this was the output. So, and what I've done is I've scaled the amount of resources on a per pupil basis. So what you can see here is that districts that are identified as city districts, they receive roughly $8,400 per pupil, again, an average figure. Rural, suburban districts, about a quarter of that, about, I can't see my numbers here, about $2,400 per pupil. Statewide, the average was about $3,700 per pupil. Again, those are averages. Some districts, because of the way the formula works, made out much better, some much worse. So with respect to just the ARP dollars that came through that last tranche, Detroit, for example, will receive about $26,000, Detroit Public School District, the main public school district in the city, $26,000 per student. At the other end, there's over 100 districts that will receive less than $1,000 per pupil. There's actually a couple districts that receive just $200 per. So clearly this has wide variations in the amount of resources that districts received. So as we look at the spending, and this is data that I had collected for the report in January, it's been updated a little bit, considerably since January in terms of the spending. Districts across the state have been slow to spend this money. Similar theme as what Eric presented here. A number of reasons. The money had to flow through the state budget, for one thing, and there was some debate. The legislature wanted its input on how this money was going to be spent, so that kind of hung up things. And then, because it was run as a grant program through the Michigan Department of Education, the Michigan Department of Education had to put together a grant application that complied with the federal requirements. That took time. Notification to districts took time. Their responses took time. So there's some understanding why there's been a lag in spending, but it's slowly ramping up. And as you can see from this chart, 2020. This is fiscal year 2020 on the left. Very little spending. 2021. I think the numbers here about $300 million, and then 2022, the fiscal year that most recently completed fiscal year for school districts, about $1.4 billion. If I looked at the reimbursements to date, this 2023 number is going to be close to $2 billion by the time the June 30th rolls around. That's when school districts end their fiscal year. So you can see this thing ramping up, and then the remaining $2 billion will be spent in fiscal year 2024 and 2025. So statewide, overall, if we look at that $5.8 billion pot, as of January 2023, when our report came out, about 38% of the total ESSER funding that was allocated to school districts was spent. And, Michigan kind of was right in the middle of the states in terms of their spend down rate on this. Most states were in the high 30% to mid 40%. There were some states that were laggards, and there were some that were on the ball and had been spending more. But Michigan, is not an outlier in terms of the district spending these resources. And that was as of January 2023. So how is the money being spent? I agree 100% with what Eric has shared with you. Getting this information from state government has been a challenge. The federal government runs a dashboard. I'll just note their most recent updated figures are for fiscal year 2021. We've really had to dig down into the bowels of the bureaucracy to get this information. And what we were able to get was the spending plans that districts submitted. So part of the Michigan Department of Education's grant program and requirement in federal law was that districts had to present their spending plans. Keep in mind, these were plans. They could change, especially over a 4-year grant period. Things come up and those plans change. But what these plans showed us, and this was across all the ESSER categories, about 40% was spent in a category called Other, which I should note, similar to the state and local resources that came down, there was wide discretion provided for school districts in the use of these resources. The federal law lists like 20 allowable uses. The other category is to maintain operations of your school district. So make sense of that. It's like everything they're doing, they can spend ESSER money on, right? So 40% was spent on this other category. Another third was spent on academic interventions. So this would be buying new curriculum, extending the school day, tutoring, new technology. And then about 18% was planned spending on capital investments. When we looked at how the spending plans varied from the first batch of ESSER to the second through the third, we did see a little migration away from other into academic intervention. So early on, districts were really just using the money to kind of pay teachers' salaries, pay to keep the lights on if the schools were open, pay for computers if kids were going to remote. And then as we get into the ESSER 3 spending plans, we see more of a pivot towards the academic interventions, which is kind of the main point of especially the ARP dollars, was to address the learning losses impacts from the pandemic. In fact, the ARP language requires that districts spend at least 20% on learning loss in their students. So, this suggests that they're hitting that minimum threshold in terms of the federal requirements. One of the things I wanted to look at was the status of individual district spending. So I've kind of talked to this point about the statewide picture. Here I'm going to shift down to what individual districts pictures look like. So keeping in mind that the per pupil amounts vary substantially, measuring the amount of the allocation that's been spent is kind of meaningless because some districts receive very large allocations on a per pupil basis, while others much smaller. But if we look at just the percent of their allocations that have been spent, the median district has spent about 30% of their allocation as of 2023. What I did in the report is I scaled the amount of unspent funds to the state's per pupil grant to kind of give a sense of, on an annual basis, how much of the unspent resources are available. And what I found was that about 2/3 of the districts statewide have less of $2,300 or less to spend. This was as of January 2023, so they had all of 23, 24, and even a little bit of 2025 to spend that money. Really not a problem. However, a handful of districts, those that receive the largest allocations on a per pupil basis, have a much larger balances to spend over this period. We calculated that 95 districts had the equivalent of about a half or more of a per pupil foundation, so about $4,500. And then when we looked at who these districts were, they were largely the districts that received the largest allocations, the ones that had the lowest percent of their allocation spent, and not surprisingly, because these were large districts too, they accounted for a good portion of the total unspent funds. So These districts accounted for about 2.3 billion of the 3.5 unspent resources as of January. And here is again, apologize, you wouldn't be able to read these districts here, but this chart shows the unspent balances across these districts, these 95 districts. I just have the group that has 3/4 or more of foundation allowance you have to spend. So over on the left side, Flint's in here, Benton Harbor's in here, Beecher, Detroit Public Schools, Hamtramck, Pontiac School District, Battle Creek. Again, these districts are the slowest spending, but they also have the largest allocations through the three pots of money. All told, they account for about 7 of every 10 unspent dollars in the state. So with the, what we found is when we looked, well, what is this doing to district's financial position? And Eric mentioned the fact that, if local governments could, they'd probably bankroll some of this money, put it in savings. Well, that's exactly what we found school districts are doing to a large degree. And how were they able to do this? Well, the ESSER resources came down, unlike traditional Title I dollars that districts have to spend on students in the current year, and they're not allowed to supplant their existing resources with those ongoing federal dollars. There was no prohibition on doing that this time around. So when districts decided to spend on current operations to kind of keep the doors open, they just replaced their general fund spending with this federal resources, and then basically put the general fund resources in reserve. And on a statewide basis, this shows up quite vividly. In 2014, statewide districts had about 1.2 billion in their fund balances statewide. That grew to 2.4. So this is before the influx of these resources. And then in the 2 years since, that 2.4 billion figure jumped to 3.3 billion, which represents about 17% of the total revenue that K through 12 districts receive each year. On a per pupil basis, this grew these fund balances from about $1,600 in 2019 to $2,300 in 2021. And again, what they've been able to do is to offset their existing general fund spending with the federal dollars. And we do see this occurring in those districts that have the largest unspent balances as well. Detroit, for example, has pivoted to spend their resources on, and I'm not saying that the city of Detroit, I'm not picking on them or the public school system down there, it's just, it happens to be one of the larger ones and generates a lot of public attention. They are going to effectively use $700 million of their ESSER funds, they got 1.2 billion, to take on the facility challenges that are in the district, upgrading school systems. And what they've done is they basically offset their general fund expenditures over the last couple of years with the federal dollars, and then we'll have $700 million in their unrestricted fund balance, which they'll then use over the next 5, 6, 7 years to invest in their capital facilities. This chart here is an attempt to kind of show the growth of the revenue, total revenue in the state, and the impact of the ESSER funding. You can see the growth both on an inflation adjusted basis and in nominal terms is just kind of shot through the roof. And then as the spending levels off in these out years, 2025, 26, we kind of return to more of a regular growth rate. So I see Arnold's standing up here. I'm just going to leave you with some questions to think about. There's a lot of things we weren't able to address here, but with the expiration of these dollars, some districts, especially Detroit, there's an article in Chalkbeat today about the city's, the school's budget that's coming out for next year. A number of districts are going to be facing a fiscal cliff. That's basically, these resources have gone away, they've built programs based on those resources, and there'll be pressures, spending pressures to maintain those programs. And in the absence of those resources, things are going to have to be cut, positions eliminated. So the question will be, how much of the resources were programmed for ongoing expenditures versus one-time expenditures? Detroit, for example, the $700 million one-time resources, but then they have the other roughly $500 million is built into their ongoing budget. Another question, were all the students' needs met with the use of these funds? We have schools are subject to annual statewide assessments. They're doing benchmark assessments throughout the year. Our districts pivoting when they see how the resources are being used and how effective they're being deployed. And there is still time to make adjustments to their spending plans, but the window is closing. And then finally, just picking up on Eric's thought and a point that I made earlier, what will parents, state officials, and taxpayers be able to discern from the spending? There's a lack of transparency, timeliness in the information that's being reported, and it may be some time before we really can answer some of the most important questions having to do with this historic investment in Michigan schools. Thank you.
So a lot of the same issues that have been pointed out in terms of local government and K-12 spending of these dollars. And now we're going to move to Bridge reporter Jonathan Oosting to see how his work has progressed in this area.
All right, well, thanks to Arnold and everybody at IPPSR for having me, and thanks to Eric and Craig as well for the informative presentations. I and my colleagues have leaned on some of their work for our reporting. In fact, some of my colleagues have done more on the school funding ESSER dollars that Craig mentioned, and I, in fact, just recently interviewed Eric for a story I was working on about local government spending. So they're the real experts, but I have attempted to at least begin to scratch the surface with some of my reporting by taking a look at how governments are spending these dollars. I cover the legislature on a regular basis, so I've seen the development of spending plans there, and I've also tried to keep tabs on local governments to whatever extent possible as one reporter based in Lansing, Michigan. As Eric mentioned, there's well more than 1,000 local governments in the state. Some of them report more frequently than others based on the federal rules on how they're spending these dollars. So it is a challenge, but A, I think it's really fascinating to see some of the ways local governments are using these dollars, and B, I think it's really important to keep tabs on them to the extent we can to make sure the money is being spent in appropriate ways. I have not actually ever seen the federal government at this point say, no, you can't spend the money in that way, based on the presentation, based on the data that local governments have presented. As Eric mentioned, there are some rules up front, but beyond that, there's really a lot of flexibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my latest reporting on it. Story here on Bridge, Michigan, highlighting some of the individual projects that local governments and state government have approved so far. So as I mentioned, it can be a challenge to get this data, and when you get it, it's a little bit overwhelming. So this is an example of data that any of you right now can download from the U.S. Treasury website. They have a spreadsheet format with basically every project approved so far by at this point, larger governments of the state and the larger cities and counties in Michigan who are required to report quarterly to provide this sort of data. So there were more than 800 projects listed as of the end of 2022. That's the most recent data we have. I believe governments were required just recently to submit their latest reporting, but that hasn't yet been made public by the Treasury. So, as Eric mentioned, there's like broad categories that local governments are allowed to spend in and report spending it in, but there's a whole lot of flexibility within those categories. So, for instance, most of the spending that I identified so far fell under the umbrella of negative economic impacts from COVID, ostensibly. But there's a whole range of solutions or projects that local governments have come up with to address that. As a reporter, I've of course been most interested in sort of the novel or real new ideas. So, for instance, I highlight one here. Ann Arbor is going to be the first city in the state of Michigan to run a guaranteed basic income program. You've probably heard about universal basic income, in the presidential election last cycle. Andrew Yang with his freedom dividend. The guaranteed basic income is a little different because it's targeted to specific income groups, low-income people generally, as is the case here in Ann Arbor. So for 2 years, Ann Arbor is going to be spending about $1.6 million of its ARPA funds on a guaranteed basic income program. They just recently partnered with UM's Poverty Solutions program to actually run this, but the idea is they're basically going to send out $500 a month checks to 100 low-income families in Ann Arbor, or folks who work in Ann Arbor, I believe, as well. We don't know exactly how they're going to identify those people just yet, but the idea was put forth by a Councilwoman Lynn Song, who basically said, in the pandemic, she obviously saw Ann Arbor for Michigan, a thriving city, right? But it became so expensive. It's become so expensive for people to live in. Most folks who work in the city and are lower income can't actually afford to live there. So she wanted to create a program to try and help out those folks. Again, it's pretty limited right now to 100 or so people. But Ann Arbor did say in some of their federal reporting that they hope it's a model they might be able to continue in the future or even expand. They partnered with UM's Poverty Solutions specifically because they not only want to run this program, but they want to compile data, create data to provide to researchers across the country who are beginning to explore this sort of income program as well. Ann Arbor will be the first city in Michigan, but a lot of cities in California have started this already, and a number of other places around the country. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that and how that program works. Another sort of bucket that folks can spend on is funds to replace revenue losses, that local governments experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. But how they use those funds, again, can really vary widely. Some of them simply directly made up for lost revenue. Others took that lost revenue and said, well, let's use it in new or different ways. So I highlight one here, Sterling Heights. They're spending $1 million of their roughly $20 million allocation to create microforests in the city. What's a microforest? Well, basically it's just like a pocket of trees. So small pocket of trees wherever they can. A small park, ostensibly, without teeter-totters or anything. Sterling Heights is a fairly well-developed city. It's full for the most part. To sort of address the urban congestion, the city thought this would be a good way to not only offer some green spaces, but also perhaps improve the environment and things of that nature. So That's an interesting idea that I talked to the mayor about there as well, and curious to see how that pans out. Again, just for reference, most of these are spending plans. As Eric mentioned, a lot of this money has not actually been spent yet. The local governments have until the end of 2024 to obligate the funding, and the end of 2025, I believe, to actually spend it. So there's a lot of time to, still work through that stuff, but folks like Eric and other local government officials I talked to said, it really is time to get the ball rolling, because this is going to take time to operationalize some of these plans. I will note that that big spreadsheet I showed you, I said I've tried to scratch the surface, because that's really, admittedly, all I've been able to do at this point. I mean, what we don't get from those federal reports is, well, who, what entity did the city hire to actually do this project? Is it, a good friend of the mayor's? Or I'm not suggesting that is the case, but that's the sort of oversight that hopefully reporters around the state, and especially local reporters who are on the ground covering these things, have the time and resources to delve into. But another big chunk is the bucket that folks can spend money on, lost revenue. I think I've mentioned that one already. But anyways, part of that is premium pay. So a lot of local governments did use money for premium pay. As Eric mentioned, Genesee County was the largest spender on that front. They spent about $7 million to provide bonuses to about 1,000 government employees in the county. I will say I think counties are especially interesting because they generally, local governments are used to having some, but, well, not a lot, but, they're used to spending on programs like this. Counties, I think, is a kind of newer territory for them in some regards. So, and they had a little more flexibility to use their money in interesting ways because, they're not directly responsible for picking up the trash or what have you. So, anyways, that's another big one. And again, as Eric mentioned, infrastructure projects, specifically water infrastructure, seems to be a real focus of the spending so far. The state government, its largest allocation to date has been for water infrastructure. There was the governor and the Republican-led legislature last year struck a deal for a $4.7 billion spending plan, with a good chunk of that, almost half of it, I think, going to water infrastructure specifically. But a lot of local governments have put money into those efforts as well. Big City, I mentioned here, is using $6 million of their own federal fiscal recovery funds to replace lead pipes. And that's a real big issue for local governments because, following the Flint water crisis, Governor Snyder, then Governor Snyder, moved to strengthen the state's lead and copper rule, or its version of the lead and copper rule, and require, at least on paper at this point, that all local governments replace their lead service lines by 2040. But there's no direct funding mechanism to help them do that. The legislature has certainly appropriated chunks of money here and there, but for a lot of local governments, they're staring at this deadline without a lot of money to pay for that sort of project. The first step was just identifying if they have lead service lines. A lot of cities had old, outdated records, on note cards, and didn't even know, so they had to do surveys first to even determine how many lead pipes they had. The state did require some initial survey data. I think that was due back in 2021 or so. So local governments at least have an idea of what they've got under the ground now, but not many of them have actually replaced or finished replacing those pipes. So look for more spending on that front. And then finally, public health, as Eric mentioned, is another big bucket that local governments can spend on. But you might think, COVID response or preparation for the next pandemic. But in fact, again, tons of flexibility. So a lot of local governments have spent their public health dollars in ways you might not expect. For instance, Detroit put a big chunk of its money into a gun violence protection program. Obviously, if you die or are shot, that is a public health issue. But, it's not necessarily what folks might envision these dollars being used for up front. But Detroit, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, that's a report they prepared for the federal government outlining what this plan is. They're buying additional mobile towers, for example, like police towers that can be used during events. They're having more vehicle recognition cameras, sort of surveillance, but not, shot spotter is another thing that they talked about, but has been controversial, or facial recognition. It's been controversial. This is just vehicle recognition. And then some new cars for their investigators, essentially, to try and, close gun violence cases. So, another thing I'll mention is some local communities have actually turned down this money. At the time I wrote this, it was 45 local communities. I think that's shrunk to like 33 when all is said and done, because some of them flat out rejected it, but others simply didn't respond to the state saying, hey, we've got this money for you. Some of them eventually did, but others made it a real point to say, we don't need this money, or we don't want it because we think it's an example of government largesse. It turned out to be sort of a self-own there, however, because the money doesn't go back to the federal government. It just is divided up amongst other local governments in the state. So by rejecting that money, those communities just gave more money to their neighbors. There have been some instances, again, I said the federal government that I know of hasn't ever rejected a spending plan, but there have been some instances where locals have had second thoughts on their own plans, depending on public pressure or perhaps legal review. So one township in Grand Traverse, for instance, the township board voted to give itself pay raises or bonuses, and they ended up backing off that and reneging in the face of public pressure. So, yeah, that's all I've got for you now. I'm going to keep digging in and looking at the stuff as I can, but I hope that was helpful.
I want to thank Jonathan, Craig, and Eric and his team at the Center for Local Government Finance and Policy for continuing to work in this area. I think as all three have noted, they're having to dig pretty deep and ask a lot of questions. And it's also incumbent upon us as citizens to ask our local officials, especially state policymakers, where's that money going? Are we tracking it? What's it being spent on? I know there was an effort early on by several of us to hopefully have local units and the state to think really big picture on this. One-time money, what are you going to use it for? Think collaboratively, work collaboratively, do regional projects. I don't want to say it's going for the same old, but it's pretty easy for human beings to default to what they normally do. And that's kind of what's happening. So again, I want to thank them. Do folks have any questions for any of these gentlemen? Peter?
Yeah, in the recent budget deal in Washington, there was some talk about callback of some of the COVID funding and stuff. Is that impacting any of these programs that we know of?
No.
Okay.
I think the clawback that, and Eric or one of these three can help me with, the clawback was money that was basically unspent from some of the original tranches of money. So it was...
Not stuff in the pipeline?
No, not stuff in the pipeline. Nope. Yes, sir.
Listening to this program, this slurp, it sounds more like slurp. You can visualize a public trough, and money's poured in from the people in the private sector, the businesses, the workers in the private sector rather, and then it's being redistributed to people in the business or the organizations in the public sector. It sounds like more welfare for the public sector than it is to benefit the people that were adversely affected by COVID. A lot of this spending is just replacing spending or supplementing spending that would have been made anyway. Where are the things like grants to families whose children were adversely affected by the shutdowns? Where's the grants to the businesses that have closed, the investors that have lost money in these small businesses, the employees that have lost their jobs?
Well, there were several programs as part of the, as part of some of the CARES Act that where businesses were able to apply for funding. And I think that some of your questions are pretty pertinent. I think state policymakers in particular are going to have some questions to answer to about where within state programming, like to families and public health and mental health, where is this money going? So,
They're giving bonuses to teachers who weren't teaching. They're sitting there someplace on a computer. You can't teach a 2-year-old or a second grader reading on the computer. It's preposterous. Those kids need a lot of help. Some of them are damaged. It's going to take forever, if ever, to recover from the damage.
Appreciate
Where's
that.
Where's the help to those kids?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Was this money intended to stimulate the economy ultimately? Or what exactly was the intent? Because it hasn't gotten into the stream of the economy yet, apparently. Not only, but 40% of it's been spent. It seems to me the shovel-ready kinds of projects should have been immediately, the money goes into that and get those people back to work if their projects were stopped. So how much of this, it really helped to stimulate the economy? I mean, I think that was the overall intent at the time, is find a way to get it into government's hands.
Well, remember, we're just talking about one tranche of the money.
Yeah.
Which
And
is
this was
ARPA. Which is ARPA. So the original funding from the CARES Act and other tranches of money, I think I'll let the economists here speak. But from my viewpoint and the research that I've seen, the research that I've done, certainly those first tranches of money work very well to stimulate the economy. Almost to the point now where, it's all blamed for the inflation that we have, right? So this ARPA funding still has a ways to go, but certainly those first programs work very well to stimulate the economy and keep the economy moving. It put money in people's pockets directly. It put money in businesses' pockets directly. So it did its job in those first tranches of money. How we move forward with this, I think is still up in the air.
Yeah, I don't think the state and local government money and the education money was not really intended for stimulus. It was intended for a longer term restructuring of organizations to deal with this new reality post-pandemic. And if you think about 4 years, that's not a stimulus. Like, stimulus has to happen now, you're right. So I don't think, other parts of ARPA may have been stimulus, other parts of the CARES Act was very stimulus related, for sure. This was more money to think about how do we restructure organizations, how do we help people who have been damaged longer term, right? So there were programs, for example, like in Flint, they've used money to help people with their back water bills. Many people couldn't pay their water bills. We didn't do any shut-offs at the time, but they owe thousands of dollars. So that's a direct assistance to those households. And most, Flint has a generally low-income population. So I don't think it would be stimulus in the traditional sense, no.
Yeah, just to the gentleman's earlier question about spending, certainly by the community things vary greatly. I mean, there have been programs in some communities to directly provide grants to businesses. For instance, there have been, as Eric mentioned, help with water bills. There have been other, public assistance programs. But, there's so many different programs. I just highlighted a few of the more novel ones.
Well, again, I want to thank Eric and Craig and Jonathan for their work on this and the information that they presented today. Still have a ways to go. As Jonathan noted, the funds on this tranche of money have to be obligated by 2024 and spent by 2025. So I'm sure we'll be back here again at some point in time updating you on these programs. And Tony, thank you for reminding me, Tony Zamani, our staff. Please fill out the surveys as to this program and others that you would like to see in the future. Thank you as always for being here. We're going to take a little break this summer and we'll be back in September. Thank you.